Near midnight, rain poured down over the Calderport docks, drumming against towering stacks of containers that loomed like a silent city of steel. Somewhere in that maze, a refrigerated cargo box trembled faintly from inside. Came the sound of pounding, growing weaker with each blow. 2 men had just sealed the outer latch. One of them tossed the ring of keys into a pool of black water, and the 2 turned and walked away, as casually as if they'd thrown out something worthless. Inside that steel box, a human being was slowly fading into the cold, and they knew it. Take one more step, and don't blame me for what happens. A low, dry voice cut through the curtain of rain. From behind the wall of containers, a tall figure stepped forward, the dark shoulders of his coat soaked through. In his hand, a gun clicked as a round chambered a sound colder, in that night, than the falling rain itself. Cormac Doyle didn't bother to glance at the 2 men. His eyes were fixed on the rusted lock. Open it, before I change my mind. None of the 3 men standing in the rain that night knew that the woman about to be pulled from that steel coffin would change everything, including the fate of the very man who had just raised his gun. If this story kept you holding your breath, hit like and share it so others can follow this journey too. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next gripping tale. The older man among the 2 swallowed hard, his eyes flicking quickly down to the puddle where the bunch of keys had just sunk. He bent down, thrust his hand into the freezing water, his fingernails scraping against the slick, slimy concrete until they touched the metal ring. His whole body trembled, not from the cold, but from the barrel of the gun pressed hard against his spine. The other man tried to edge 1 foot toward the darkness, but Cormac merely tilted the muzzle of his gun by 1 centimeter, and that was enough. No one dared breathe too loudly. The sound of the key striking the lock rattled like teeth chattering in a fever, and only on the 3rd try did the rusted bolt finally give way with a dry, grating screech. The heavy steel door groaned as it was dragged open on frozen hinges, revealing the deep, swallowing darkness inside the shipping container. Cormac took 1 step forward. The light from the flashlight clipped at his hip, sweeping inward, and that cold beam came to rest on a curled-up shape in the farthest corner. A woman. She had pressed her back tight against the steel wall, both knees drawn up to her chest, her hair matted in clumps against her bloodless cheeks. Her lips had turned purple, her skin was pale as candle wax, and every breath that escaped her mouth became a thin, broken wisp of smoke. And yet, in the midst of that cold that was eating its way down into the marrow of her bones, her eyes were still open, still fixed on the tall man who had just appeared, watching him with absolute, desperate suspicion. One of her hands was clenched tightly against the front of her shirt, gripping something hard and small that she refused to let go of, even though her whole body was shaking violently beyond her control. Cormac had seen no shortage of terrible sights in his life, but that look in her eyes made something inside his chest ache with a strange, unfamiliar throb. It wasn't the look of someone begging to be saved. It was the look of an animal backed into a corner, still bracing itself for one last strike, even though it didn't have a scrap of strength left. He spun around, his face cold and blank, as he looked at the 2 men standing rooted in the rain. His voice dropped lower, and the softer it became, the more it sent a chill down the spine. "You listen carefully," he said, each word falling clear and hard, like stones rolling across ice. "Who paid you for this filthy work? I don't need to know. But from this second on, if I see either one of you around this harbor one more time, that iron box will have someone else lying inside it, and next time, no one's coming to unlock the door." The older man opened his mouth as if he meant to say something. Perhaps an excuse. Perhaps a name. But Cormac had already raised the muzzle of the gun level with his eyes. "Get out." Just 1 word. The 2 men didn't need to hear it a second time. They turned and bolted into the rain, their footsteps splashing wildly across the wet harbor ground before vanishing among the black rows of containers, leaving behind only the sound of the rain and 1 man turning back toward the steel coffin. Cormac slid the gun back into its holster, yanked off his outer coat, still soaked through with water, then stopped short because it was just as cold as the air itself. He stepped inside the container, lowered himself until he was level with the woman. She immediately shrank back, lifting her free hand as if to stop him, though the motion was so weak it was almost invisible. "I'm not one of them," he said, his voice softening a little, though it still carried that deep, rough weight that belonged to him. "You'll freeze to death here before morning if you keep sitting like this." She didn't answer. She only tightened her grip on the thing hidden inside her shirt, her eyes still searching him through lashes crusted with ice. Cormac didn't wait any longer. He slid one arm beneath her knees, braced the other beneath her thin shoulder, and lifted her off the steel floor. And it was that very instant that made him freeze for a fraction of a second. She was weightless, so light she barely seemed real, as though nothing remained but a skeleton wrapped in a thin layer of clothing. A fragile weight he had told himself for 3 years he would never have to hold in his arms again. The feeling rose up from some hidden place he had thought sealed forever, sharper and colder than the rain lashing against them both. He clenched his jaw, forced it down, and stepped out of the container with the woman held tightly in his arms, striding quickly toward the car waiting in the darkness. Cormac's mansion stood on a hillside overlooking the city, a silent mass of gray stone hidden behind rows of leafless trees, and by the time the car rolled through the heavy iron gate, the woman in his arms had gone almost completely still. He carried her straight into the warmest room in the house, where the fireplace was still burning low, then laid her down on the thick rug spread before the flames, instead of rushing at once for blankets and bedding, because he knew something most people didn't know, that warming a body that had been sunk too long in the cold too quickly could be more dangerous than the cold itself. The heart could stop if heat flooded in too fast. He stirred the fire until it rose just enough, not too fiercely, then carefully stripped away the thin clothes that had soaked through and frozen stiff against her body. His eyes keeping a respectful distance, his rough hands, so accustomed to cold and merciless work, now doing everything with a caution that felt strange even to him. He covered her with the thickest sweatshirt he could find, wrapped her in layer after layer of wool blankets, leaving only her face exposed, then heated a kettle of water until it was only warm, not scalding, mixed in a little honey and a few slices of ginger, and patiently fed her one small spoonful at a time, through teeth that were still chattering hard against one another. After each spoonful went down, he paused, pressing the back of his hand to her forehead to see whether warmth had begun to return, and in that silence, broken only by the soft crackle of burning wood, something inside him stirred faintly, something he'd spent a great deal of effort burying. Because he'd once done these exact same things before. He'd once knelt beside a body fading just like this, 3 years earlier, in another room where a fireplace had also been burning, and where another woman had been breathing thinner and thinner breaths. Back then, the woman lying there had been his wife, and the illness eating her from the inside hadn't let go, no matter how much money he poured out, no matter how many of the finest doctors he brought in from the farthest places, because when she'd needed him most, he'd been somewhere in the city, busy widening his empire, busy taking another harbor, another route, another deal, until by the time he finally came home, she had only enough strength left to hold his hand one last time and couldn't say another word. That final letting go had frozen some part of him forever, turning him into the man the whole city both respected and feared. And it was also the reason that tonight, when he heard the faint knocking from inside a shipping container in the rain, he couldn't walk away. He couldn't turn his back and leave one more woman to fade out in a cold he had the power to stop. He closed his eyes for a moment, forced that sharp, icy memory to sink back to the place it had come from, then opened them again, dipped the cloth into the basin of warm water, and wiped each of her frozen fingers until the blood began to move through them again. That night, he didn't touch his own bed once. He pulled a chair close to where she lay and sat there with his gun resting across his lap, his eyes never leaving the faint rise and fall of the stranger's chest, counting every breath as if it might stop the moment he looked away. Each time she let out a soft moan in her fevered sleep, he leaned forward, adjusted the blanket, pressed his hand to her forehead once more, and each time, he told himself in silence that this time would be different. This time he wouldn't let the cold win. This time he would keep watch until the sun came up. Outside, the rain kept falling steadily over the stone roof, and the city lay sunk in mute darkness at the foot of the hill, while inside that small, warm room, the man the whole city feared sat awake through the night, guarding the breath of a woman whose name he didn't even know yet. Maren woke when the pale gray light of early morning had already slipped through the gap in the curtains, and the first thing she felt wasn't warmth, but panic, because she didn't recognize the ceiling above her, didn't recognize the scent of wood and wood smoke in the air, didn't recognize the thick wool blanket covering her body. She jerked upright too fast, and a wave of dizziness swept over her at once, making the whole room tilt and sway. Her hand's first instinct was to claw at the front of her shirt, searching for the thing she had held tightly for hours inside that steel coffin, but it wasn't there anymore. That emptiness made her heart seize, and when she lifted her head, she saw the tall man sitting in the chair near the wall, watching her in silence like someone who had been there for a very long time. She backed into the corner, dragging the blanket up like a fragile shield, her voice hoarse and shaking, yet still forcing out each word clearly. "Who are you? Where is this? What have you done to me?" Cormac didn't move. He didn't lean closer by so much as a fraction of an inch, because he understood well enough that, to an animal newly freed from a trap, every sudden movement was a threat. "You're in my home," he answered, his voice low and calm. "Last night, I pulled you out of that shipping container at the harbor. You nearly froze to death. Now you're safe, at least a great deal safer than the place you just came from." Maren didn't believe a word of it. In the world she'd been drowning in, kindness never appeared for no reason, and a man who lived in a house like this, with eyes that cold, with the way he had sat watching over her all night with a gun resting across his lap, a man like that didn't save strangers out of goodness. She thought at once of the worst possibility, that he was only another link in the net tightening around her, that they had saved her from death only to pry out whatever she was hiding before killing her in their own way. Her eyes darted quickly toward the door, measuring the distance, calculating how far these trembling legs could carry her before she collapsed, and Cormac read every one of those calculations on her face, as clearly as words on paper. "You're thinking about running," he said, not as a question, but as an observation. "You can try, but you'll drop before you reach the gate, and it's still raining outside." She clenched her teeth and said nothing, her eyes never leaving him. Then he did something that made her go still. He rose slowly, walked to the wooden table in the middle of the room, took a small object from a drawer, and set it down on the tabletop. It was a metal storage drive, no bigger than half her palm, the very thing she had clutched inside her shirt and believed she had lost. He gave it a light push, sending it sliding across the table toward her. "I could have taken it last night while you were unconscious," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "I could have opened it, copied it, done whatever I wanted with it, but I didn't touch it." Maren looked at the hard drive, then back at him, confusion plain in her dark, exhausted eyes. "I don't need this," Cormac went on, his voice dropping lower, though every word seemed to grow heavier. "The only thing I want to know is who locked you inside that container, who wanted you dead badly enough to pay someone to do something that cowardly." In that moment, in a room so quiet she could hear the rain striking the roof, two strangers looked at each other across the length of a table, one of them prepared to offer the only thing she had left in exchange for her life, the other having just pushed it back to her as though it held no value at all. And for the first time since she had opened her eyes, Maren felt the world she was living in tilt in a direction she couldn't possibly have seen coming. Maren didn't answer his question that night, and Cormac didn't force her to. He simply left her in the warm room with the door unlocked, a gesture it took her several days to fully understand, because people only left a door open when they didn't consider you a prisoner. It wasn't until the third day, when her legs had grown steadier and the fever had fully broken, that she dared leave the room, following the long stone-floored corridor to a small balcony overlooking the wide hall below. And it was from that hidden place behind the wall that she witnessed something that made her understand whose house she was in. Down below, Cormac sat behind a large desk, not raising his voice, not waving his hands, only sitting there with the calm composure of a man who had never had to fight for the right to speak in any room he entered. Across from him stood a well-dressed man, sweating heavily even though the room wasn't warm, his hands clasping together and then coming apart again, his mouth spilling explanations that grew more frantic with every passing moment. Maren couldn't hear everything, but she pieced together enough to understand that this man had skimmed money from a shipment passing through the harbor, had believed the amount was small enough that no one would notice, and had been wrong. "I swear I'll pay it all back," the man said, his voice breaking at the end of the sentence. "It's just that this month has been difficult. I never meant to go behind your back, sir. Never." Cormac let the silence stretch for several more beats, and that silence was the most frightening thing of all, because it gave the other man enough time to imagine every worst possibility on his own. Only then did Cormac speak, his voice still light, as if nothing at all were happening. "You do know the thing that bothers me isn't the money, don't you? I spend that much in a single meal. What bothers me is that you thought I wouldn't notice. You sat at this table, shook my hand, called me your partner, then turned your back and decided I was blind." The man opened his mouth to speak, but Cormac only raised one finger slightly, and the words died in his throat. "You still have a chance to walk out that door on your own 2 feet," Cormac continued. "You'll return what you took, plus interest for the insult, and you'll never set foot in any harbor of mine again. In exchange, I'll forget we ever had this conversation. That's a very generous offer. Far more generous than the kind I'm used to making. You should take it before I remember I'm not a generous man." The man nodded over and over, stammered a few words of thanks, then almost ran out of the hall, and only when the heavy door closed behind him did Maren realize she had been holding her breath. She stood there behind the wall, her heart pounding, trying to fit together two images that couldn't possibly settle into one. On one side was the man who had just made a grown man tremble with nothing but a soft voice. On the other was that very same man who, only nights ago, had knelt down to feed her spoonful after spoonful of warm water and stayed awake through the night to guard her breathing. She couldn't understand it. A man who could be that cold, who could hold enough power in his hands to make an entire city bow its head, should have looked at a poor widow freezing to death in a shipping container as if she were a piece of trash not worth his concern. And yet he had given up an entire night to keep her tethered to the living. The fear inside her was still there, untouched, but now it was mixed with something else. A confused curiosity, a question that kept twisting through her mind as she quietly withdrew from the balcony. Who was this man, truly, and why, out of all the lives he could have ignored, had he chosen to save hers? In the days that followed, Cormac didn't ask another question, but he quietly had his people look into the life of the woman staying under his roof, and what he uncovered, piece by piece, began to paint the portrait of a life that had been crushed a little at a time. He learned that before she had been locked inside the shipping container, Maren had worked as a night shift cleaner in a city high-rise, scrubbing empty corridors when the whole city had gone to sleep, bending her back through 2 shifts in a row to pay down the mountain of debt her husband's death had left behind. He also learned that in that place there was a night shift manager named Dwyer, a man who liked showing off his scrap of petty authority by tormenting people weaker than himself. More than once, he had withheld her wages with made-up excuses, had forced her to clean an entire floor all over again because of a stain that didn't even exist, had thrown insults at her that a widow had to swallow because she had no choice but to hold on to that job. What Cormac didn't tell Maren was that Dwyer's name was on the list of petty hired hands who worked for Garrett Vane, and that the man himself had been one of the links that helped them set their eyes on her. One evening, he had a car take her to an old warehouse on the edge of the city without telling her in advance where they were going. And when she stepped inside, she stopped short, because in the middle of that empty stretch of floor, Dwyer was sitting in a chair, his face drained of every drop of blood, with Cormac's men standing silently on both sides of him like statues. Maren hadn't had time to understand what was happening before Cormac stepped in front of the man, and this time his voice wasn't any louder than usual, but it made the whole warehouse seem to freeze over. "I hear you like making women clean an entire floor again because of stains that aren't real," he said. "I hear you like holding back the wages of people who have nothing left to lose. Did it make you feel powerful, standing over someone who couldn't fight back?" Dwyer stammered. He began to deny it, began to apologize, but Cormac only tilted his head and looked at him as if he were something filthy stuck to the bottom of his shoe. "I'm not going to touch you," he said, "because you aren't worth dirtying my hands over. But starting tomorrow, you won't have a single job left in this city. Not one building, not one harbor, not one person will dare hire you. You'll understand what it feels like to have everything stripped away and be unable to do a thing about it. Exactly the feeling you planted in others. And every morning when you wake up, you'll remember why." He jerked his head, and his men dragged Dwyer, shaking like a leaf, out of the warehouse. In only a few sentences, without a single punch thrown, Cormac had taken from him the very thing he had once used to crush other people. When only the two of them were left in the empty warehouse, Maren stood still for a long time, and when she finally lifted her eyes to look at him, something in them had changed. The wall of ice she had raised around herself from that first night had finally begun to crack. "Why did you do this for me?" she asked, her voice so small it was almost swallowed by the silence of the warehouse. Cormac only answered, "Because no one deserves to be trampled just because they're poor and alone." Maren looked at him for a while longer, and then, as if those words had loosened a knot she had kept pulled tight for an entire year, she softly spoke the thing she had never dared say aloud to anyone, that her husband hadn't died in an accident the way the records claimed, that she knew, deep in her bones, he had been murdered, and that the thing she had clutched inside the shipping container that night was exactly what people were willing to kill her to get back. Cormac didn't look surprised. He only watched her with a calm that made her feel believed, then said, "Then tell me everything, from the beginning." They returned to the mansion, and beside the fire in the familiar room, Maren began to speak. At first her voice was still hesitant, but then it grew steadier, as if every word she forced out lifted away a piece of the burden she had carried for far too long. "My husband's name was Daniel," she said. "He worked as an accountant for a large transportation company in the city. He was a decent man, an honest man, so honest that sometimes I used to blame him for being too rigid, and it was that very honesty that got him killed." She told him that while reviewing the books, Daniel had discovered numbers that didn't match, enormous sums of money moving through shell companies and then returning clean, as if nothing had ever happened. Following those numbers had led him to one name, Garrett Vane, a man the whole city knew as a successful and generous businessman, though behind that expensive suit was an enormous money laundering machine. Daniel had done what an honest man would do. He gathered evidence, copied every document, recorded every transaction, and planned to take it all to someone with authority. But he underestimated Garrett, she said, her voice catching. He didn't understand that a man like Garrett always has eyes and ears everywhere. One evening, Daniel didn't come home, and the next morning, people came knocking on her door to tell her he had died in a car accident on the road near the harbor. The car had lost control and plunged into the water, a conclusion so neat and clean that no one bothered to ask questions, no one except her. Because she knew her husband. She knew he would never drive recklessly, and because a few days before he died, he had become different. He had told her that if anything happened, she had to remember he had done everything for the two of them and their child, a sentence she didn't understand then, and only later truly felt in her bones. "The most painful thing," Maren said, her eyes reddened as she stared into the fire, "was that for a long time, I misunderstood him. People spread the story that Daniel was the one who had embezzled the money, that he died because of debts he had brought on himself. And in the middle of grief, and all those debts piled on top of me, there were moments when I half believed it, nights when I lay there holding my child, and asked myself whether I had ever truly known the man I called my husband. That thought tortured me more than the loss itself." She went on to say that Garrett knew Daniel had backed up the evidence but couldn't find all of it, that he suspected she was holding the rest, and that was why his people had followed her for months. That was why she had to work in the dark and send her little daughter to stay somewhere safe, far from every danger, until the night they decided not to wait any longer. They kidnapped her, locked her inside the shipping container, to force her to reveal where the evidence was hidden. And when she still wouldn't speak, they chose to leave her to die in the cold and stage it as another accident. "This hard drive is only half of it," she said softly. "Daniel hid the other half in a place only I can find, and as long as I'm alive, Garrett can't rest easy." Cormac listened in silence, every word from her carving one more line into the decision taking shape inside him. And when she finished, he only replied that from now on, she no longer had to face this alone. He didn't realize, and neither did Maren, that in the dim doorway behind them, his most trusted right hand, a man who had stood beside him for many years named Sloane, had been standing there quietly long enough to hear the whole story. And when Sloane turned on his heel and left, something flickered for an instant in his eyes. Something that wasn't loyalty, but looked more like a calculation newly sparked to life. News of the woman in the mansion and the things she was holding soon spread to those closest to Cormac, and not all of them looked at her the way he did. One afternoon, in the study where he usually received the men under his command, a man named Rourke, someone who measured everything in the world by its price, spoke up and suggested what he considered the wisest course. "Garrett Vane will pay any price to get that woman and the hard drive," he said, his voice lowered as if he were discussing a profitable deal. "We're sitting on a gold mine and don't even realize it. All you have to do is send out one word, and Garrett will come to you himself. You can name your price. You can trade her for control of those eastern harbor routes you've wanted for so long. What does one poor widow matter compared with what we'd get back? You only have to nod." Maren was passing through the hallway at that moment, and her steps stopped at the half-open doorway. Her heart seemed to drop into a pit of ice, because she had just heard the very future she had always feared spoken aloud so brazenly. Once again, she had been turned into a piece of merchandise to be bargained over. Once again, she was about to be handed over, just like that night in the shipping container. She held her breath and waited for the answer, and the silence before Cormac spoke felt as long as a lifetime. Then he spoke, and his voice wasn't loud, but it was so cold that Rourke had to take half a step back. "What did you just say?" Cormac asked, not because he hadn't heard, but because he wanted to force the man to hear his own words again. Rourke stammered as if he meant to repeat himself, but Cormac cut him off. "I pulled that woman out of a container so she wouldn't die," he said. "And you sit here, in my house, suggesting that I sell her back to the very man who put her in it? Is that what you think I am? You've stood beside me for how many years, and you still think I'm the kind of man who would trade a human life for a few docks?" Rourke opened his mouth, but Cormac had already risen to his feet, and that single movement was enough to silence the entire room. "There are lines people don't cross," he said. "Not because of the law, not because of fear, but because once they cross them, there's nothing left in them worth calling human. And any man who sits in front of me and fails to understand that line has no place in this organization." He stripped Rourke of every responsibility on the spot, cut him off from all business, all privileges, and ordered him taken out of his sight, all in a few sentences, without a single shout, yet final as the edge of a blade. When the room had emptied, Cormac stood with his back to the door, not knowing that Maren was still there at the threshold, her hand pressed against her chest, and this time it wasn't from fear. She had prepared herself to hear him agree. She had been ready for the fragile trust that had just begun to glow inside her to be snuffed out again. And yet this man had refused, not after weighing profit against loss, but instantly, as if to him, it had never even been a choice. She quietly stepped back without letting him know she had heard. But that evening, when he sat alone beside the fire, she brought him a cup of hot tea and set it beside him without saying a word, and he only gave a slight nod and accepted it, asking nothing. Between them, there was no confession, no graceful speech, only a steaming cup of tea and a silence that had changed. A silence that was no longer the distance between one stranger and another, but something warmer, quietly growing between two people who had once believed they would never trust anyone again. That fragile trust that had just begun to glow changed something important inside Maren, because now she was no longer someone sitting still and waiting to be protected. She began to act, and she realized that in this fight, there were things only she could do. While Cormac's people bent over Garrett's financial networks and kept running into one wall after another, it was Maren who sat down among the documents copied from the hard drive and saw what even his most skilled men had missed. "I understand how Daniel thought," she said, her eyes moving over each line of numbers. "He never kept anything important in the place people would look first. He always split everything apart, half in one place, half somewhere else, so if one half fell into the wrong hands, it would still be useless without the other." She showed him the gaps in the data, the places where the numbers pointed toward something that wasn't on the hard drive, and she stated with certainty that the other half of the evidence was still out there somewhere, hidden carefully, in exactly the cautious way her husband would have chosen. But what truly made Maren the mind at the center of the investigation wasn't the numbers. It was a kind of knowledge no one else possessed, the knowledge of someone who had once been an invisible shadow inside the buildings where wealthy people came and went every day. She knew the high-rise where Daniel had once worked, as well as she knew the lines in her own palm, because she had cleaned every floor of it through those long nights. She knew the forgotten rooms, the storage archives no one ever bothered to check, the blind corners the cameras couldn't reach, the places where a man like Daniel could hide something and feel certain it would remain there for years. And then, while searching through her memories, she suddenly spoke a name. "There's someone," she said, her voice lighting up all at once. An old colleague of Daniel's named Marcus Hale. The two of them used to be very close, and Marcus was one of the few people Daniel trusted. If he wanted to leave something with someone for safekeeping, it could only have been Marcus. She remembered that after the funeral, Marcus had tried to contact her several times, his eyes always looking as if he wanted to say something but then stopped himself, and back then she had been sunk too deeply in grief and debt to pay attention. She had missed what she now believed with certainty had been a message Daniel left behind. She turned to Cormac, this time not to ask permission, but to lay out a plan, and he noticed the change in her at once. He saw that the woman sitting before him was no longer the trembling shadow from the shipping container, but someone who knew exactly what she needed to do. He didn't fight her for the lead. He simply did what he did best, placing in her hands every resource she needed: people to protect her, cars to move her, doors that only his name could open, so she would be free to do the part only she was capable of doing. "I'll find Marcus," Maren said, "but we have to be careful. If Garrett has thought of him too, then we aren't the only ones searching." Cormac nodded, And in the moment, he watched her arrange every piece in her mind with clarity and sharpness. Something flashed in his eyes that was almost respect, because he was used to watching people fear him, used to those who only knew how to nod and obey. But he had never met anyone like this woman. Someone life had beaten down to the very bottom, and yet who had still kept a clear mind and a will that refused to break. She wasn't strong because she had a gun in her hand or someone powerful standing behind her. She was strong because she understood the things powerful men always look down on. And that quiet strength of hers was about to become the card Garrett Vane would never see coming. They weren't the only ones who had thought of Marcus Hale. And that was what made everything become breathlessly urgent. That very morning, Marin found the name. Another piece of information had also reached Garrett Vane through a leak no one in Cormac's group had expected, that an old colleague of Daniel's might be holding the thing he had been hunting for all this time, and Garrett wasn't a man who hesitated. He sent his people out at once. As Cormac's car tore through the gray afternoon, Marin sat beside him, both hands clenched tightly together, because a dark premonition kept rising stronger and stronger inside her chest. Marcus lived in a small house on the outskirts, a place so quiet it felt almost dreary. And when the convoy turned onto the road leading there, Marin was the first to see the strange car already parked in front of the gate. A dark car with no license plate, one she recognized at once as a bad omen. "They got here first," she cried, and Cormac didn't waste a second. He signaled for his men to spread out, while he rushed straight for the door. Inside, Marcus had been cornered by two men, one of them gripping his collar, demanding answers about something Marcus kept insisting he didn't know. And just as the other man raised his hand, the door burst open. Cormac didn't say a single unnecessary word. He charged in with a speed that seemed almost impossible for a body that large, flinging the man holding Marcus away, and in that cramped room, a fierce struggle broke out. Cormac's men poured in behind him, pinning each man down one by one. No gunshot rang out, because both sides understood that a shot would bring the kind of trouble no one wanted. This was a fight of fists and force, swift, clean, and brutal. Marin had been told to stay in the car, but she couldn't. She slipped in through the doorway, and she was the first one to run to Marcus as he staggered, catching him and asking breathlessly if he was hurt. "Marcus, it's me, Marin, Daniel's wife," she said quickly, and the older man's panicked eyes suddenly recognized her, suddenly softened in the middle of the chaos, while Cormac and his men drove the others out of the house, forcing them to flee toward the dark car before disappearing down the empty road. Marcus took Marin's hand with trembling fingers and pulled her inside, toward a corner of the wall where he had kept hidden for an entire year, the thing Daniel had entrusted to him. "Daniel knew this day would come," he said, his voice broken and uneven. "He gave me something and made me swear I'd only give it to you, only to you. I tried to find you so many times, but then you vanished. I thought it was already too late." He pried up a loose floorboard and took out a small, carefully wrapped package. Inside was a storage device exactly like the one Marin had been keeping. The missing half she had been certain existed, and with it was a letter that had yellowed with time. On the envelope, there was only one handwritten line, and she recognized it at once with a pain that went straight through her heart. It was Daniel's handwriting, and beneath it was her name. Marin took the letter, both hands trembling, the whole world around her seeming to fall silent for a moment. But this wasn't the time, because Cormac had come back inside, his breathing still hard, urging everyone to leave at once before the others could call for reinforcements. They took Marcus with them to a safe place, and as the car rolled away from the empty road, Marin sat there clutching the letter tightly to her chest. The final half of the evidence was now in their hands. But what made her heart beat so wildly in that moment wasn't the victory they had just won. It was the handwriting of her dead husband pressed against her chest, a message sent from the past that she had finally touched, but still hadn't found the courage to open. It wasn't until late that night, when the mansion had sunk into silence and everyone had returned to their own place, that Marin finally found the courage to sit down beside the fire with the letter in her hands. For a very long time, she did nothing but stare at her own name on the envelope, at that familiar slanting handwriting she had thought she would never see again. Cormac sat a few steps away, saying nothing, not urging her, only staying there, a quiet presence steady enough to let her know she wasn't alone, and perhaps it was that very thing that gave her the strength to finally open the envelope with trembling hands. The letter wasn't long, but every line Daniel had written seemed to rise into a voice inside the quiet room, and the very first sentences made her whole chest tighten. He wrote that if she was reading these words, Then the thing he had feared most had happened, that he hadn't made it back to her the way he had always hoped, and he asked her to forgive him for keeping everything from her all that time. Not because he didn't trust her, but because he had known that if she knew nothing, she would be safer, and those people would have no reason to touch her. He wrote that he had discovered the filthy work Garrett Vane had been doing, and couldn't close his eyes to it, because if he stayed silent, he would no longer be the husband, the father, he wanted his daughter to be proud of. He would rather risk everything than let her grow up in a world where evil kept walking free because decent people had chosen to look away. When Maren read that far, she broke down crying, the tears she had held back for an entire year finally spilling over, because now she understood. Now she knew with certainty that the husband she had doubted on those long nights had never been the traitor people claimed he was. He had been a man brave enough to put his own life on the line to protect what was right, and more than anything, to protect her and their child. For the past year, she had carried a double burden inside her, the grief of losing her husband and the torment of knowing there had been moments when she had questioned him. And this letter washed that guilt clean. It gave back to her the image of the man she had loved, whole and bright again. He told her not to live forever in the past, not to let pain or fear imprison her, to be strong for their daughter, to live a decent life and hold her head high, because that was the best way to keep him alive. And in the final lines, he wrote that wherever he might be, the love he had for her and their child would never fade, and that she was never truly alone. Maren collapsed forward, her shoulders shaking with each sob, the letter pressed tightly to her chest, and in that moment, Cormac quietly left his chair and sat down beside her. He didn't offer any hollow words of comfort. He simply placed one steady hand on her shoulder, letting her know there was a shoulder there if she needed it. And she did. She leaned into him and cried out everything she had held inside for far too long, while he sat there and received that sorrow in silence, because more than anyone, he understood what it was to lose someone he loved without having the chance to say a final goodbye. He understood the weight of unfinished things. Two people who had once told themselves their hearts had hardened, had closed forever after their separate losses, now sat beside each other in the flickering firelight, needing no confession of love, no promise of forever. That shared silence alone was enough for two old wounds to find shelter in one another, and for something deeper than words to take root quietly between two damaged souls. After that night, Cormac realized there was something he could do for Maren without needing her to ask, something she had longed for through all those months, but had never dared dream of while she was running for her life. He knew that her little daughter, Posy, had been sent to stay with a trusted, distant aunt in a peaceful town far from the city, kept safe from every storm all this time, and he understood that what could heal this woman more than anything else was the chance to hold her child in her arms again. He arranged everything carefully, had his people make sure the road was absolutely safe, and then, on a rare clear morning after days of rain, he only told Maren there was someone he wanted her to meet. When the door opened, when a tiny figure with curly brown hair rushed in and cried out, "Mommy!" Maren sank to her knees and gathered her daughter into her arms, and mother and child held each other so tightly it was as if nothing in the world could ever tear them apart again. Posy chattered to her mother about everything, about the tabby cat at her aunt's house, about the pictures she had drawn, about the sky full of stars that she counted every night before falling asleep, always saving the brightest star for her mother, and Maren could only laugh through her tears, pressing her cheek to her daughter's sun-warmed hair, letting that small warmth fill the hollow place inside her chest. In the days that followed, the mansion, once so cold and solemn, suddenly echoed with laughter, a sound those stone walls hadn't heard in a very long time. Posy ran through the wide hallways, delighting in everything she saw, and she grew especially attached to the tall, quiet man she had first approached with shyness, because children have a strange kind of instinct. They always know who is kind beneath a stern face. One afternoon, Cormac found himself sitting on the living room floor, patiently letting the little girl stack wooden blocks into a wavering tower on his knee, and when the tower came tumbling down and Posy burst into bright laughter, something strange happened on his face. He smiled, a real smile, not the cold curl of his mouth he used to make people keep their distance, but a smile rising from a place inside him he had thought was frozen forever. Maren stood silently at the doorway watching the scene, the man the whole city feared sitting on the floor in building blocks with her daughter, and her heart tightened with an emotion she couldn't quite name, because it had been far too long since her little girl had had an adult presence beside her in that way. and far too long since Marin herself had felt anything close to a home. That evening, the three of them sat around the dinner table, Posey talking endlessly while the two adults now and then caught each other's eyes across the candlelight and quickly looked away, like two people who weren't used to happiness. And in that simple moment, none of them mentioned Garrett, or the evidence, or the dangers still waiting outside. They only allowed themselves to enjoy one evening of being ordinary people. But hidden inside that rare peace was a fragile ache that could break the heart. Because deep down, both Cormac and Marin knew this was only a brief pause. One deep breath before the true storm came crashing in. The small happiness they had just touched was still terribly unsteady while the enemy remained out there. And to keep this newly glimpsed home, they would still have to pass through the harshest trials waiting ahead. The storm came sooner than they had expected, and it came from the very place no one had imagined, from within. Sloane had stood beside Cormac for more years than anyone else. He had been the right hand Cormac trusted completely, the man who knew almost every hidden corner of his empire, and for that very reason, his betrayal became the deadliest blade of all. In Sloane's eyes, the man he had once respected for being cold and sharp had changed from the moment that woman stepped into this house. He saw Cormac growing softer, saw him letting emotion lead him instead of reason, saw him refuse a profitable deal because of some fanciful principle, and to a man like Sloane, who believed only in strength and gain, that was the sign of a king no longer worthy of the throne. He had secretly contacted Garrett Vane several days earlier, had agreed on a price for the loyalty he was willing to sell, and that night, when the mansion had fallen into sleep, it was Sloane himself who disabled the security system, threw open the gate he was supposed to protect, and let Garrett's men pour into the darkness. Cormac woke because of an instinct honed through years of living among danger, an unusual silence, a stray sound in a place where a guard should have been, and in a single instant, he understood what was happening. He rushed to Marin's room before the first footsteps could echo up the stairs. Woke her, his voice urgent but still steady. "Someone has broken in. You have to come with me right now and do exactly what I say." Posey, by good fortune, had been taken back to safety with her aunt the day before, following the caution they had both agreed upon. So the little girl was far from every danger that night, and that alone was what allowed Marin's chest to hold on to a little calm in the middle of her panic. The mansion, once so still, now rang with pounding footsteps, shouted commands, and then the confrontation erupted through the dark halls. Cormac's loyal men fought back fiercely, but they had been caught off guard, stripped of their defensive advantage by a traitor, and the battle quickly turned chaotic. Cormac pulled Marin along through passageways only he knew by heart, moving while taking down each man who blocked their path with the strength and finality of someone fighting to protect what he treasured. There wasn't a trace of hesitation in a single blow he struck, but as they crossed the great hall, a figure suddenly lunged from the shadows, and in that life-or-death instant, when a gun barrel aimed straight at Marin, Cormac didn't calculate for even a second. He turned and stepped in front of her, using his own body as a shield, and the sharp blast tore through the air. His whole body jolted, a dark stain spreading quickly across one shoulder, but he still stayed on his feet, still managed to bring down the man who had fired before he could shoot a second time, then turned back and pushed Marin behind him. "You've been shot!" Marin screamed, both hands trembling violently as she saw the wound in his shoulder, but Cormac only clenched his teeth, his voice still forcing itself to remain calm. "It's fine. I'm not dead yet. Now we keep moving." He pushed her toward a door leading to the lower level, each step growing heavier, his face turning pale from the loss of strength, and yet the arm supporting her never loosened. And it was in that darkest moment, when the man who had once believed himself unbeatable had to lean in part on the woman he had sworn to protect, when the traitor stood somewhere in the shadows watching his benefactor's world collapse, that Marin understood she could no longer be only the one being shielded. If they wanted to survive this night, she would have to become the one who changed the course of everything, using the only weapon she had. As she helped Cormac down to the lower level, Marin's mind raced with every beat of her heart, and in the middle of that panic, an old instinct rose up inside her, the instinct born from years of working in the darkness of large buildings, the kind of knowledge no powerful person ever bothered to notice, but now it had become the deciding card. She had spent her whole life in service corridors, in workers' passageways, in mechanical rooms. The owners of those buildings didn't even know existed, and during the few days she had stayed in this mansion, she had done exactly what a person like her always did by habit. She had quietly memorized its layout. She knew where the main electrical panel was, knew which corridors the lights didn't reach, knew which exit led out to the back garden in a way no stranger would ever find. "Listen to me," she whispered to Cormac, her voice recovering a calm that surprised even her. "There are more of them, and they have the advantage because they can see where they're going. But if this whole house falls into darkness, that advantage belongs to whoever knows the way best, and that person is me." Cormac looked at her, and even though he was straining against the wound in his shoulder, he understood her at once. He nodded. Merrin left him in a safe, hidden corner, then slipped alone into the darkness, following the wall toward the mechanical room she had memorized, her bare feet moving so softly they made no sound at all, exactly the way she had walked for years, so she wouldn't disturb the people sleeping inside the buildings she cleaned. She found the main electrical panel, her hand gliding over the switches in the dark, and then she pulled the main breaker down hard. In an instant, the entire mansion sank into a blackness thick as ink. Every light snapped out, and Garrett's men immediately went from shouting orders to crying out in confusion, because now they were blind in a place they didn't know, crashing into walls, stumbling over furniture, losing all sense of direction. But Cormac, who knew this house like the palm of his own hand, moved through the dark as if it had been made for him. He swallowed the pain, moved silently, and took down one man after another as they fumbled helplessly, never knowing where the danger was coming from. Merrin kept guiding him through the blind spots she had memorized, whispering directions. "There's a step here, a pillar on the right, 3 steps ahead, then a turn." Together, they turned the whole house into a trap. Only the two of them knew how to cross. The balance shifted with every passing moment, and then came the traitor's turn. Sloane, who had been so sure of victory, was now lost in the very darkness he had thought he controlled, and as he groped for a way to escape, he came face to face with the man he had betrayed. The clash between them was sudden and brutal in the dark, but Cormac, wounded though he was still guided by Merrin's whispers and by his own knowledge of every centimeter of his home, while Sloane had nothing left but the panic of a man who had lost every advantage. Victory went to the man who deserved it. When Cormac finally overpowered him and pinned him to the floor, he didn't say much. He only spoke one sentence that made even Sloane fall silent. "You thought I became weak because I learned to care about one human being. But you were wrong. That's exactly what gave me something to fight for, while you have nothing but greed." When the emergency lights finally came back on, the attack was over. Garrett's men had either been captured or had fled, and amid the wreckage, Cormac turned to look at the woman who had just saved them both, not with a gun, but with the quiet intelligence that the world had spent her whole life looking down on. And in the way he looked at her now, there was no longer only respect, but something far deeper. Garrett Vane wasn't a man who accepted defeat, and when his attack by force failed, he turned to a far more dangerous weapon, turning the law into an instrument of his own. Only a few days after the night of the raid, while Cormac was still recovering from the wound in his shoulder, news began spreading through the city, and it was news staged with careful attention to every detail. People said that a widow named Merrin Whitlock was wanted in connection with her own husband's death, that she was the one who had embezzled enormous sums of money and then invented a story to escape blame, and that she was now hiding with the evidence she had stolen. Behind that false accusation stood Inspector Pruitt, a man Garrett had bought long ago, a man who wore a badge but had sold off his conscience, and it was he who signed the warrant, turning Merrin from a victim into someone hunted by the entire machinery of justice overnight. It was a vicious move, because Garrett understood that no matter how powerful Cormac might be in the underworld, he couldn't protect someone wanted by the authorities without making himself a target, without dragging his entire empire into the line of fire. He had placed Cormac exactly where he wanted him, inside a choice that seemed to offer only one way out. Cormac's men, the ones left after the purge, began to worry, and a few of them said aloud what the cold logic of their world told them, that keeping this woman meant declaring war on Garrett and the authorities at the same time, that the price could be everything Cormac had built his whole life, that perhaps the time had come to consider letting go in order to preserve the larger whole. Merrin knew that clearly, and she was the one who came to Cormac first. She stood before him, her face so calm it made his heart tighten, then said the thing she had been thinking about all night. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I've pulled you in too deep already. You have an entire empire, people who depend on you. I can't let everything fall apart because of me. Let me go. I'll find a way on my own. I don't want to be the thing that makes you lose everything." She spoke those words with firmness, but her eyes betrayed her, because inside them was all the fear of someone about to step back into the darkness alone. Cormac looked at her for a long time, and when he finally spoke, there wasn't even a shadow of hesitation in his voice. "What do you think I built all this for?" he asked. "If, when it matters, I trade a human being for my own peace, then what meaning does any of it have? An empire kept by betraying the innocent isn't worth keeping." He stepped closer to her and went on. "I once stood by and watched someone I loved leave this world while I was helpless to stop it. I swore to myself I'd never let that happen again if I still had the power to prevent it. So listen to me clearly. I won't hand you over. Not today, not ever, even if that means I have to burn everything I own to the ground." Maren went still, tears sliding down her face, because no one in her life had ever been willing to risk that much for her. And in that moment, she understood that the man standing before her wasn't only choosing to protect her, he was choosing to become the best man he could still become. But she understood something else too, that she wouldn't let him fight alone, that if Garrett wanted to use the law as a weapon, then they would have to turn that very weapon back against him, and she already had exactly what they needed to do it. The plan was Maren's, and it was so bold that at first even Cormac had to weigh it carefully, because instead of continuing to hide, she chose to step straight into the most dangerous place of all. She would show herself as bait to lure Garrett out, and the place she chose was none other than Calderport Harbor, where everything had begun on the night she had nearly died inside that steel container. In the days before that, Maren had done what her place as an invisible person allowed her to do. She had quietly found a way to reach someone, an honest prosecutor named Eleanor Reyes, a woman who had long suspected Garrett but had never had enough evidence to touch him, and who also stood beyond the reach of men like Pruitt. Maren gave her the whole story, along with the promise of the evidence she needed, and Reyes, together with a few trusted associates, agreed to be there, hidden in a discreet position at the harbor, to witness and record everything. The trap was set perfectly. Word that Maren would be at the harbor with all the evidence was deliberately allowed to reach Garrett's ears, and just as expected, greed and arrogance drew him out, personally, because this was the thing he had been hunting for too long, and he didn't trust anyone else to retrieve it. Garrett arrived with his men and Inspector Pruitt, confident that victory was already in his hands, that he would take back the evidence and erase this troublesome woman once and for all. He found Maren standing alone in the open space of the harbor beneath the cold lights, and he couldn't hide the triumph on his face as he approached. "You've cost me far too much effort," Garrett said. "Now hand over the rest of it, and perhaps I'll give you a gentler death than the one I had planned." But Maren didn't look afraid. She only looked at him and said, "You killed my husband because he discovered you were laundering money through shell companies, didn't you? You locked me inside that container to force me to reveal where the evidence was hidden. And now you've framed me to silence me forever." She spoke loudly, each word clear and precise, and Garrett, in the arrogance of a man who believed no one could hear him except his own people, laughed and admitted everything. "That's right, and so what? Your husband was a fool who didn't know his place, and you're about to follow him. No one can touch me. I've bought the law outright," he said, then glanced toward Pruitt standing beside him with the look of an accomplice. The very moment that confession ended, floodlights blazed on from every direction, and Eleanor Reyes and her people stepped out of the darkness. Every word Garrett had just spoken had been recorded in full, clearly and completely. The triumph on his face vanished at once, replaced by the terror of a man who had just realized he had dug his own grave with his own hands. He ordered his men to attack, and a brief struggle erupted across the harbor, but Cormac's people had already been lying in wait, and they swiftly subdued Garrett's men before they could do any real harm. Pruitt tried to use the chaos to escape, but he was stopped at once, the badge on his chest now nothing more than proof of his own betrayal of conscience. As for Garrett, when he realized every path of retreat had been sealed off, he still struggled in desperation until Cormac himself stopped him, and this time, the powerful man didn't need violence. He only looked straight into his enemy's eyes and said, "You thought everything could be bought, but there are some things that are never for sale, and today you're going to learn that." Garrett Vane was led away by Reyes and her people, beneath the blinding lights of the harbor, trapped in the very net of law he had once believed he had purchased outright, while Maren stood there beneath the night sky, in the place where her nightmare had begun, finally able to lay down the burden she had carried through all those long months. The months that followed passed like a slow cleansing of everything Maren had endured, all the evidence Daniel had left behind, made whole at last from its two halves, together with Garrett's own confession at the harbor, was enough to bring him before the court, and this time no amount of money could buy his freedom. Garrett Vane received a long, unending sentence behind bars, where he would have plenty of time to think about the people he had once trampled underfoot. Inspector Pruitt also had to pay for betraying his own conscience, stripped of his badge and forced to face the law he had once mocked. But for Marin, the most precious victory wasn't in those sentences. It was in the fact that Daniel's name was finally cleared. People no longer spoke of him as an embezzler, but as an honest man who had dared to stand against evil and had paid for it with his life. And for a wife, nothing could be more precious than seeing her husband vindicated. The debts that had once weighed so heavily on her shoulders were also lifted when the truth came to light. And for the first time in years, Marin was able to draw a truly easy breath. She didn't become a wealthy woman, and she had never wished for that, because she understood better than anyone that a person's worth is never measured by how much money they have. With a small amount she had saved, along with the quiet help Cormac offered her as one equal to another, not as charity handed down from above, she opened a little bakery on a peaceful street corner, a place filled with warm fragrance and laughter, where little Posy could run safely after school, and where Marin could hold her head high and live an honest life, just as Daniel had told her to do in his letter. As for Cormac, the relationship between them didn't grow into the story of a poor woman whose life was changed by a powerful savior. It became something far more equal and beautiful. Two broken people finding a place to lean in each other, one bringing protection, the other bringing the warmth his hardened heart had been missing for so long. He was still that powerful man, but now there was a light in his eyes that people had thought had gone out forever. And every afternoon when he stopped by the little bakery, sitting quietly in his familiar corner while watching mother and daughter laugh together, what people saw there wasn't a frightening boss, but only a man who had finally found a place to come home to. Their story is a quiet reminder that human dignity is never measured by wealth or poverty, that a woman crushed to the lowest point by life can still rise again through her own courage and intelligence, and that true strength doesn't lie in the power to dominate others, but in choosing to use that power to protect the vulnerable, because that is what truly makes a person noble. If this story moved you and kept you watching until the very end, please press like and share it so this journey can touch the hearts of many more people. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next emotional and meaningful stories.